A millionaire returns to his hometown. At the bus stop, a woman with 4 children catches his attention. Intrigued by her familiarity, he approaches her. What he discovers shocks him. Before you hear this heartfelt story, subscribe to the channel for more unforgettable tales. The scorching sun of New York City beat down on the asphalt that Wednesday afternoon. Cars lined up on a congested avenue, honking incessantly, their occupants impatient with traffic that seemed not to move. Amidst the urban chaos, a black limousine stood out, not for its imposing presence, but for the figure who had just emerged from it. Richard Matthews, 35, CEO of one of the largest technology companies in the world, was setting foot on American soil for the first time in 5 years. His impeccable Italian suit contrasted with the chaotic scene around him. With a gesture, he dismissed the driver. "I'll continue on foot, John. This traffic jam is endless and I need to stretch my legs after so many hours of flying." The driver, surprised, tried to argue. "But sir, the hotel is almost a mile from here. Are you sure?" Richard nodded, grabbing his leather briefcase. "Absolutely sure. I need to breathe some fresh air, or what's left of it in this city." As he walked along the sidewalk, Richard observed the changes in his hometown. New buildings had appeared, others had disappeared. Modernity mixed with the old in an almost poetic way. His thoughts, however, were far away. He mentally reviewed the week's agenda: meetings, business lunches, a potential $1 million acquisition. Everything calculated, as his life had been for the past years. That's when something unexpected happened, something that not all the MBAs in the world could have prepared him for. As he turned a corner, his eyes were drawn to a bus stop. It wasn't the structure itself that caught his attention, but rather the scene unfolding there. A woman appearing to be just over 30 was trying to organize 4 small children. The children, restless, ran from one side to the other, while the woman, visibly tired, tried to keep them under control. "Michael, don't run. Anna, let go of your sister's hair. Peter, please stay still just for a minute." The voice. That voice. Richard felt his heart race. It was a voice he hadn't heard in years, but one he would recognize anywhere in the world, a voice that instantly transported him to a past he had tried so hard to bury. Marianne. His feet seemed glued to the ground. He wanted to move, wanted to flee from there, but something kept him fixed, observing the scene as if it were a film in slow motion. The children, how old were they? 4, 5 years old, and there were 4 of them. Quadruplets. Impossible. But as his eyes scanned the children's faces, a terrifying pattern began to form in his mind. The shape of one of the girl's eyes, the mischievous smile of one of the boys, the upturned nose of the other girl, and the determined chin of the other boy. These were features he saw every day in the mirror. Without realizing it, Richard took a step forward, then another and another, until he found himself standing just a few meters from Marianne and the children. That's when one of the girls noticed him. "Mommy, who is that man in the suit?" Marianne, who was crouched down adjusting one of the boy's shoelaces, looked up. Her eyes widened in recognition, and for a brief moment, Richard saw a whirlwind of emotions pass through those eyes he had once known so well. Surprise, hurt, anger, and fear? "Richard!" Her voice came out as a whisper, almost inaudible in the noise of the city. He took another step forward, his throat suddenly dry. "Marianne, these children." Before he could finish his sentence, the bus arrived, its abrupt stop breaking the moment of tension. Marianne, as if awakening from a trance, quickly began to hurry the children. "Come on, children, the bus is here. Quick, quick!" The children, obedient, began to board the vehicle. Marianne, however, hesitated for a moment before boarding. Her eyes met Richard's once more. "Tomorrow, noon, coffee shop at the corner of 5th Avenue and Broadway." And with that, she boarded, leaving Richard standing on the sidewalk, stunned. The bus departed, taking Marianne and the 4 children with it. Richard remained motionless, his brain trying to process what had just happened. Questions accumulated in his mind. Were those children his? Why had Marianne never contacted him? How was this possible? Thunder in the distance brought him back to reality. He looked at the sky and noticed that dark clouds were rapidly approaching. The rain began to fall, first in sparse drops, then in an intense downpour. People around him ran for shelter, but Richard remained standing, letting the water run down, his face and soak his expensive suit. At that moment, all his carefully planned life, all his business successes, seemed insignificant. In a matter of minutes, his world had been turned upside down. Slowly, he began walking toward his hotel. Each step was heavy, as if he were carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. The raindrops mingled with tears he didn't even realize he was shedding. Upon arriving at the luxury hotel lobby, he ignored the surprised looks from the staff at seeing the powerful CEO soaked and with a lost look. He went straight up to his suite, locked the door, and collapsed on the bed. The night would be long, very long, and tomorrow. He would have to face the consequences of decisions made 5 years ago. Decisions that, he now realized, had changed not only his life, but the lives of 5 other people. Richard closed his eyes, but sleep did not come. Images of the children and Marianne danced in his mind. Questions without answers tormented him. And for the first time in years, the man who had always been in control of everything found himself completely adrift, not knowing what the future held. The rain continued to fall outside, like a metaphor for the emotional storm that was forming within him. Tomorrow would be a new day, a day that would change everything. And Richard Matthews, the relentless CEO, the man who had conquered the business world, would have to face his greatest challenge yet, his own past and the consequences of his choices. The night passed like a blur for Richard. Hours dragged on. As he stared at the ceiling of the hotel room, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. When the first rays of sunlight finally penetrated through the curtains, he got up, exhausted but determined. He looked at himself in the mirror and barely recognized the man staring back. Deep dark circles marked his face, and his unshaven beard gave him a disheveled look, so different from his usual impeccable appearance. But there was no time for vanities. He had a scheduled meeting, a meeting that could change everything. At tea. 11:45 a.m., Richard was already seated at a table in the coffee shop at the corner of Fifth Avenue and Broadway. His fingers nervously drummed on the untouched coffee cup in front of him. Each time the door opened, his heart leaped. 2 minutes before noon, she entered. Marianne. Her eyes scanned the place until they found Richard. For a moment, she seemed to hesitate, but then walked decisively toward him. "Hi, Richard," she said, sitting across from him. "Marianne," he responded, his voice almost a whisper. I don't even know where to begin." She observed him for a few moments, her eyes carrying a mixture of emotions that Richard couldn't fully decipher. "How about we start with the obvious?" Marianne finally said. "Yes, Richard, those children you saw yesterday are your children, our children." The words hit Richard like a punch to the stomach. He knew, of course he knew, but hearing her say it out loud made it all too real. How did this happen?" he stuttered, immediately regretting the foolish question. Marianne let out a bitter laugh. "I think you know very well how it happened." "Richard, or have you already forgotten that last night before you left for Asia?" Memories of that night flooded Richard's mind, the passionate farewell, the whispered promises, the future that seemed so bright ahead of him. "But why did you never tell me?" he asked, his voice laden with guilt and confusion. Marianne's eyes narrowed. "Never told you? Richard, I tried to tell you in every possible way. I called your cell phone countless times, sent emails, messages. I even went to your company's office here in New York, but I was barred at reception. You simply disappeared from my life." Richard felt the weight of shame fall on his shoulders. He remembered how in the first months in Asia, he had deliberately ignored Marianne's attempts at contact. At the time, he convinced himself it was the best thing to do, that he needed to focus on his career, that a long-distance relationship would only hinder his plans. I'm sorry," he murmured, knowing these words were insufficient given the magnitude of what he had done. "Feeling sorry doesn't change the fact that I raised 4 children alone for the past 5 years, Richard," Marianne replied, her voice trembling with contained emotion. It doesn't change the sleepless nights, the sacrifices, the financial hardships. It doesn't change the fact that our children grew up without knowing their father. Richard felt his eyes fill with tears. I want to meet them, Marianne. I want to be part of their lives. Please give me that chance. Marianne observed him for a long moment, as if assessing the sincerity of his words. Finally, she let out a tired sigh. It's not that simple, Richard. You can't just appear in their lives after 5 years and expect everything to be fine. They have feelings, they have an established routine. I can't allow you to enter their lives only to disappear again when things get difficult. I won't disappear, Richard affirmed vehemently. I know I've made terrible mistakes, but I want to fix things. Please, Marianne, give me a chance to prove it. She studied him for a few more moments before slowly nodding. All right, but we'll do this, my way and my time. And if I notice this is negatively affecting the children, it's over. Understood? Richard quickly agreed. Yes, of course, anything you say. Marianne took a napkin and wrote down an address. This is our address. Come tonight at 7 p.m. The children will have already had dinner and will be calmer. It will just be a short visit for you to meet them. Richard took the napkin as if it were a precious treasure. Thank you, Marianne. I'll be there. She stood up, preparing to leave. One last thing, Richard. Don't come expecting to be welcomed with open arms. For them, you're a stranger. For me, you're someone who hurt me deeply. It will take time to rebuild any kind of trust. With those words, she left the coffee shop, leaving Richard alone with his thoughts and the weight of his past actions. The rest of the day passed like a blur for Richard. He cancelled all his meetings, ignored the dozens of messages and calls on his cell phone. Nothing else mattered except the meeting he would have that night. At 6:45 p.m., Richard found himself standing in front of a simple building in a middle-class neighborhood of New York. The contrast with his usual luxury environment couldn't be greater. He took a deep breath, gathering courage, and pressed the intercom. Marianne's voice sounded metallic through the device. You can come up, Richard. Apartment 502. The elevator seemed to move in slow motion. When it finally reached the 5th floor, Richard felt his heart beating so hard he was sure it could be heard throughout the entire hallway. He stopped in front of apartment 502, raised his hand to knock, but hesitated. On the other side of that door were 4 children. His children. Children he didn't know, who didn't know him. What would this meeting be like? What would he say? How would they react? Before he could knock, the door opened. Marianne was there, her face a mask of forced calm. Come in, she said simply. Richard took a step into the apartment and was immediately hit by a wave of sounds and movements. Children's laughter, the sound of running feet, animated voices discussing some cartoon. And then, suddenly, silence. 4 pairs of curious eyes turned to him, 4 faces that were a mirror of his own, mixed with traces of Marianne. Richard felt the world spin around him. There they were, his children, his family. Children, Marianne said, her voice soft but firm. This is Richard. He is your father. The silence that followed was deafening. Richard, the powerful CEO who commanded meeting rooms with unwavering confidence, now felt completely lost in front of those small faces, observing him with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. It was one of the girls who finally broke the silence. Taking a step forward, she tilted her head and asked in a sweet voice, "Where have you been all this time?" The innocent question hit Richard like an arrow to the heart. How to explain 5 years of absence to a 5-year-old? How to justify the unjustifiable? Swallowing hard, he knelt down to be at eye level with the girl. I was very far from here, working in another country, but now I'm back, and I really want to meet all of you. The other 3 slowly approached, forming a semicircle around Richard. He looked at each of them, marveling at the similarities and differences he saw. "What is your job?" asked one of the boys, his eyes shining with curiosity. I run a company," Richard replied, feeling strangely inadequate. His professional achievements, which had seemed so important before, now sounded empty in front of those innocent gazes. "Are you going to live with us now?" the other girl asked, her voice a mixture of hope and caution. Richard quickly glanced at Marianne, who was observing the scene with an indecipherable expression. I don't know yet, but I want to spend a lot of time with you, if you'll come. Let me. The fourth child, who had remained silent until then, took a step forward. His eyes, identical to Richard's, studied him with surprising intensity for someone so young. Why weren't you here before? He asked, his voice carrying a maturity beyond his years. The question hung in the air, heavy and accusatory. Richard felt the weight of every wrong decision he had made in recent years. How to explain unbridled ambition, fear of commitment, and selfishness to a child. I made many mistakes, he began, his voice choked. Mistakes that kept me away from you and your mother. But I'm here now, and I really want to be part of your lives if you'll give me a chance. The children exchanged glances among themselves, as if having a silent conversation. Finally, the girl who had asked the first question approached and, to everyone's surprise, hugged Richard. Okay, she said, her voice muffled against his chest. You can try. The others soon joined the hug, and Richard found himself surrounded by 4 pairs of little arms. Tears flowed freely down his face as he hugged them back, feeling for the first time the unconditional love that only a father can feel. Marianne watched the scene with a mix of emotions, relief at seeing the children accepting Richard, fear of what the future might bring, and a hint of something she didn't want to admit: hope. As the group hug broke apart and the children began to bombard Richard with questions about his life and his travels, Marianne knew this was just the beginning of a long journey. A journey of reconciliation, rebuilding, and perhaps redemption. For Richard, that moment marked the beginning of a new life. A life where spreadsheets and financial reports would give way to children's drawings and bedtime stories. A life where success would not be measured by zeros in the bank account, but by smiles and hugs from 4 small beings who, he now realized, were the most important thing in the world. The night advanced, and with it, the first chapter of a new story began to be written. A story of family, love, and second chances. The sun had barely risen when Richard woke the next morning. His eyes burned with fatigue, but his mind was more alert than ever. Memories of the previous night flooded his thoughts, the curious faces of his children, their innocent questions, the unexpected hug that melted his heart. He sat on the edge of the hotel bed, running his hands over his face. In less than 48 hours, his life had been turned upside down. The powerful CEO, accustomed to making decisions that affected thousands of lives, now found himself completely unprepared to deal with the 4 most important lives that had ever crossed his path. He picked up his cell phone and saw dozens of messages and missed calls from his team. The million-dollar acquisition, which 2 days ago was his only concern, now seemed insignificant. With trembling fingers, he typed a message to his vice president. Take over the negotiations. Urgent personal matters prevent me from proceeding. At the moment, I trust you. Having sent the message, Richard got up and walked to the window. The city of New York was already pulsing out there, millions of lives following their normal courses. But for him, nothing would be normal anymore. The sound of a notification brought him back to reality. It was a message from Marianne. The tea. Children asked about you this morning. If you want, you can come have breakfast with us 8 a.m. Richard looked at the clock, 6:45. Without thinking twice, he ran to the shower. In record time, he was dressed and ready to go. He opted for more casual clothes this time, exchanging the suit for jeans and a polo shirt. At 7:55, he was standing in front of Marianne's building, his heart racing with anxiety and expectation. He climbed the stairs, preferring not to wait for the elevator, and soon was standing in front of apartment 502. He took a deep breath and rang the doorbell. The door opened, revealing Marianne. She looked tired, but there was a slight smile on her lips. Good morning, she said, stepping aside for him to enter. The children are finishing getting ready. Richard entered, immediately enveloped by the sounds and smells of a house with children in the morning. The aroma of fresh coffee mingled with the smell of children's shampoo. Laughter and friendly discussions echoed down the hallway. "Daddy's here," shouted a child's voice, And suddenly Richard found himself surrounded by 4 small hurricanes in pajamas. "Good morning, children," he said, smiling broadly as he tried to hug them all at once. "Are you going to take us to school today?" asked Anna, the girl who had hugged him the night before. Richard looked at Marianne, uncertain. She nodded slightly. "If you want, I'd love to," he replied, feeling a wave of joy at seeing the children's faces light up. "But first," Marianne intervened, "breakfast. Everyone to the table. Let's go." The children ran to the small kitchen table, dragging Richard with them. He found himself seated between Michael and Peter, while Anna and Julia settled on the other side. Marianne began serving breakfast: bread, fruits, milk, and cereals. Richard watched amazed how she managed to attend to everyone's requests simultaneously, cutting a fruit here, serving milk there. "Do you want coffee?" she asked Richard, catching him by surprise. "Oh yes, please," he replied, still feeling a bit out of place in this new family dynamic. While they ate, the children bombarded Richard with questions. They wanted to know about his work, his travels, if he knew how to speak other languages. Richard answered as best he could, trying to simplify complex concepts so they could understand. "Have you ever ridden an elephant?" asked Michael, his eyes shining with curiosity. Richard laughed. "No, I've never ridden an elephant, but I've seen many up close when I was in Thailand." "Wow!" the children exclaimed in unison. Marianne observed the interaction with a mix of emotions. It was strange to see Richard there interacting with the children as if he had always been part of their lives. Part of her wanted to resent this ease with which he seemed to fit in, but another part, found herself imagining what it would have been like if he had been present from the beginning. Breakfast ended too quickly in Richard's opinion. Soon the children were grabbing their backpacks, ready to go to school. "Remember to take your art projects," Marianne said, as she helped Julia tie her shoelaces. "Today is exhibition day at school." Richard felt a pang of guilt. There was so much about his children's lives that he didn't know. "What kind of art projects?" he asked, trying to learn more. "Paintings," Anna replied excitedly. "I made a family portrait." Richard's heart tightened. Would he be in that portrait? As they went down to the garage, Richard noticed Marianne's modest car. It was clearly a vehicle designed for a large family, but it was far from the luxury he was accustomed to. "We can go in my car," he offered. "It has more space." Marianne hesitated for a moment, but nodded. "All right, but I'll drive. You don't know the way to the school." The journey to the school was a surreal experience for Richard. Sitting in the passenger seat, he constantly turned around to answer the children's incessant questions and marvel at every little detail about them. Upon arriving at the school, Richard felt a lump in his throat. Parents were saying goodbye to their children, an everyday scene that was completely new to him. The children got out of the car, each proudly carrying their art project. Before entering, however, they turned to Richard. "Will you be here when we get out?" Peter asked, his voice betraying a mixture of hope and fear. Richard looked at Marianne, who nodded slightly. "Yes, I'll be here," he promised, feeling the weight of that promise in every fiber of his being. The children smiled and ran into the school. Richard and Marianne stood for a moment, watching them disappear among the crowd of other students. "And now?" Richard asked, feeling lost. Marianne let out a tired sigh. "Now, Richard, we talk. There's a lot we need to discuss." They found a cafe near the school and sat down. For a few minutes they remained in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. "I want to be part of their lives, Marianne," Richard finally said, his voice laden with emotion. "I know I don't deserve it. I know I caused unimaginable pain to you and them, but I want to fix things." Marianne studied him for a long moment before responding. "Richard, it's not that simple. You can't just appear after 5 years and expect everything to magically resolve itself. The children may seem happy now, but they have questions, they have wounds, and I don't know if I can trust you again." Her words hit him like a punch to the stomach, but Richard knew they were true. "I understand," he said softly. "I don't expect you to trust me immediately. I just ask for a chance to prove that I've changed, that I want to be the father they deserve." Marianne nodded slowly. All right, but let's establish some rules. First, you can't make promises you can't keep. If you say you'll be somewhere, you have to be there. Second, we need to establish a routine. The children need stability. And third, you need to understand that you can't just throw money at the problem and think that solves everything. Richard agreed with each point. I'll do whatever it takes. Marianne, I'll reorganize my life, my commitments. The children and you are my priority now. They spent the next hour discussing logistics, schedules, and the children's needs. Richard absorbed every piece of information as if his life depended on it, and in a way it did. When they finally finished, Marianne looked at her watch. It's almost time to pick up the children. As they walked back to the school, Richard felt a mixture of anxiety and determination. He knew the path ahead would be difficult, full of challenges and painful moments. But looking at Marianne, seeing the strength and dedication she demonstrated with every word about their children, he knew he would do anything to be worthy of this family. The sound of the school bell echoed in the distance, and soon a crowd of children began to exit through the gates. Richard anxiously searched for the familiar faces of his children, and then there they were, 4 small figures running toward them, their faces illuminated by huge smiles. "Daddy! Mommy! You came!" they shouted in unison. At that moment, as he opened his arms to receive the collective hug from his children, Richard knew his life would never be the same, and for the first time in a long time, he was genuinely happy about that. The weeks that followed were an emotional roller coaster for Richard. Each day brought new discoveries, unexpected joys, and inevitably, challenges that made him question whether he was truly prepared for fatherhood. On a Saturday morning, Richard arrived early at Marianne's apartment. He had promised to take the children to the park, something he had never done before. When the door opened, he was greeted by an organized chaos that was already becoming familiar. "Daddy!" shouted Anna, running to hug him. Her hair was disheveled and she was still in her pajamas. "Good morning, Princess," Richard smiled, picking her up. "Ready for the park?" "Yes," she exclaimed, her eyes shining with excitement. Marianne appeared in the hallway looking exhausted. "Richard, I'm glad you're here. Can you help Michael find his sneakers? I'm trying to get Julia to eat breakfast." Richard nodded, putting Anna down and heading to the boys' room. He found Michael rummaging through a pile of clothes. "Hey, champ. Looking for something?" Michael looked up, frustrated. "My blue sneakers are missing. I can't go to the park without them." Richard knelt beside the boy. "Let's look together, okay? Where did you last see them?" After a few minutes of searching, they found the sneakers under the bed. Michael put them on quickly, a smile of relief on his face. "Thanks, Dad." That word, Dad, still made Richard's heart leap. It was a mixture of joy and guilt that constantly accompanied him. Returning to the living room, he found Peter sitting quietly on the sofa, a book in his hands. "Hey, Peter, don't you want to get ready for the park?" The boy looked up, hesitant. I prefer to stay and read." Richard felt a pang of concern. Of all 4, Peter was the one who seemed most distant, most reserved toward him. Sitting beside his son, Richard asked softly, "Can I see what you're reading?" Peter showed the cover, Treasure Island. "Wow!" Richard exclaimed, genuinely impressed. "That's an amazing book. You know, when I was your age, I loved pirate stories." Peter's eyes lit up a bit. "Really?" "Yes," Richard smiled. "How about we take the book to the park? You can find a nice tree to read under for a bit, and afterward, if you want, we can play treasure hunt." Peter seemed to consider the idea for a moment before nodding shyly. "Okay." Finally, after what seemed like an eternity of preparations, everyone was ready to leave. Richard observed Marianne skillfully organizing the children, distributing caps, applying sunscreen, and checking if everyone had water. "How do you do this every day?" he asked, a mixture of admiration and guilt in his voice. Marianne shrugged, a small smile on her lips. "Practice. A lot of practice." The park was full that sunny morning, families scattered all around, children running and shouting happily. Richard felt momentarily overwhelmed by the responsibility of caring for 4 energetic children in such an open space. "Relax," Marianne said, noticing his tension. "They know the rules, they won't stray far." The following hours were a whirlwind of activities. Richard found himself pushing swings, helping build sandcastles, running after balls, and, as promised, organizing an improvised treasure hunt for Peter, which ended up involving all the children. It was during a moment of pause while the children ate sandwiches that Marianne had prepared that Richard noticed a group of mothers looking in his direction and whispering. "Don't pay attention to them," Marianne said, following his gaze. "They're probably just curious. It's not every day that a new dad appears on the playground." Richard felt a wave of guilt hit him. "They must be thinking the worst of me." Marianne sighed. "Richard, you can't control what others think. What matters is what you're doing now, the effort you're making to connect with the children." He nodded, grateful for her understanding, even though he didn't feel he deserved it. As the afternoon progressed, Richard began to notice signs of fatigue in the children. Anna became more tearful, Michael more impatient, Julia quieter. Only Peter seemed content, sitting under a tree with his book. "I think it's time to go," Marianne said, starting to gather their things. The way back to the apartment was quiet, the children exhausted but happy. Richard carried Anna, who had fallen asleep in his arms, while Marianne guided the other 3. Upon arriving, the children went straight to the bath, leaving Richard and Marianne alone in the living room. "Thank you for today," Marianne said, softly. The children loved it. Richard smiled, tired but happy. "I'm the one who should thank you for giving me this chance." There was a moment of silence between them, laden with unspoken emotions. "Richard," Marianne began, hesitant, "I know you're trying, but I need to know, is this permanent? Do you really intend to stay?" The question hit him like a punch to the stomach. He knew it was fair for her to question, given his history, but it still hurt. "Marianne," he said, looking her in the eyes, "I know I've made unforgivable mistakes. I know I've hurt you and the children in a way that perhaps can never be fully repaired. But I can promise this. There is nothing in this world more important to me now than our family. I'm here to stay, no matter what happens." Tears formed in Marianne's eyes, but she held them back. "I want to believe you, Richard, but it will take time." "I understand," he nodded. "And I'm willing to prove day after day that you can count on me." At that moment, the sound of hurried footsteps interrupted the conversation. The children returned to the living room, in pajamas and with wet hair. "Dad, are you going to read us a story before bed?" Michael asked hopefully. Richard looked at Marianne, who nodded slightly. "Of course, champ," he smiled. "What story do you want to hear?" As he followed the children to the bedroom, Richard felt a mixture of gratitude and determination. He knew the path ahead would be long and full of challenges, but for the first time in his life, he felt he was exactly where he should be. Night fell over New York, and inside that small apartment, a family slowly began to heal and reconnect. Richard, sitting on the edge of the bed, with 4 pairs of attentive eyes fixed on him as he read, realized he had found something much more valuable than any business deal he had ever closed: the true meaning of home. The shrill sound of the alarm clock tore Richard from his sleep. He fumbled with the nightstand, looking for his cell phone to silence the alarm. 5:30 a.m. Sighing, he sat up in the hotel bed that had become his temporary home in New York. His mind immediately began cataloging the day's tasks. Video conference with investors at 7 a.m., meeting with the local team at 10 a.m., lunch with a potential partner at noon, and Hannah's ballet presentation at 4 p.m. Richard smiled, thinking about his daughter. In the past few weeks, she had talked about nothing else but the presentation. He had promised to be there, in the front row, and nothing in the world would make him break that promise. As he prepared for the day, his phone vibrated with a message from Marianne. "Good morning. Reminder, Anna has a presentation today at 4 p.m. She's nervous. It would be good if you could call her before going to the office." Richard immediately dialed Marianne's number. After a few rings, he heard Anna's sleepy voice. "Hello? Good. Morning, princess, ready for the big day?" Anna's voice immediately perked up. "Dad, I'm super nervous. What if I forget the steps?" Richard felt his heart melt. "Anna, you've practiced a lot. You're going to do wonderfully well. And even if you forget a step, the important thing is to have fun, right?" "Right," she replied, sounding a bit more confident. "You'll be there, won't you?" "I wouldn't miss it for anything in the world," he assured. "I'll be in the front row, cheering for you." After saying goodbye to Anna and exchanging a few words with Marianne about the preparations for the presentation, Richard finished getting ready and left for the office. The morning passed in a blur of meetings and phone calls. Between one conversation and another, Richard found himself looking at the photo of the 4 children that now occupied a prominent place on his desk, how his life had changed in such a short time. At 3:30 p.m., Richard began gathering his things, anxious to leave and arrive in time for Anna's presentation. That's when his assistant hurriedly entered his office. "Mr. Matthews, we have a problem. Mr. Tanaka from the Japanese company has arrived unexpectedly and insists on having a meeting now." Richard felt his stomach sink. Mr. Tanaka was a crucial partner for the company's expansion in Asia. Postponing the meeting could cost millions. For a moment he hesitated. The old Richard wouldn't have thought twice before canceling any personal commitment for a business deal of this size. But now, "Tell Mr. Tanaka that unfortunately I have an unavoidable commitment," Richard replied firmly. "Can we reschedule for tomorrow morning?" The assistant looked shocked but nodded and left to relay the message. Richard picked up his phone and dialed a familiar number. "Marianne, I'm leaving the office now. I'll arrive in time to see our star shine." The school auditorium was packed when Richard arrived. Anxious parents crowded together, cameras in hand, ready to capture every moment. He spotted Marianne seated in the front row, saving a place for him. "I thought you wouldn't come," she commented when he sat down. "I promised," Richard replied, simply. The lights dimmed and the show began. When Anna entered the stage, Richard felt his heart fill with a pride he had never experienced before. She danced with grace and determination, her little face concentrated on each movement. At the end of the presentation, as the audience applauded enthusiastically, Richard saw Anna's eyes scanning the crowd until they found his. The smile she gave upon seeing him there, fulfilling his promise, was worth more than any business deal he had ever closed. After the show, as families gathered in the school courtyard for a small reception, Richard found himself surrounded not just by Anna, but also by Michael, Peter, and Julia, all eager to tell him about their day. "Dad, did you see how I danced?" Anna asked repeatedly. "Yes, I did, my love. You were amazing," he responded, hugging her tightly. "Daddy, tomorrow is Bring Your Parents to My Classroom Day," Michael reminded him. "Will you be able to come?" Richard hesitated for a moment, remembering the packed schedule that awaited him, but looking at his son's hopeful face, he knew what the right choice was. "Of course, champ, I wouldn't miss it for anything." Marianne, who was observing the scene closely, approached Richard. "Thank you for coming," she said softly. "It meant a lot to Anna, to all of us actually." Richard felt a lump in his throat. "Marianne, I know I still have a lot to prove, a lot to make up for, but I want you to know that I'm trying, really." She observed him for a moment, her eyes softening. "I know, Richard. I can see your effort. Just keep it up, okay?" That night, after putting the children to bed and reading another chapter of Treasure Island to Peter, Richard returned to his hotel room. He turned on his laptop, ready to make up for the work he had left behind. While answering emails and reviewing reports, his gaze kept drifting to the photo of the children on his bedside table. He remembered Anna's smile on stage, the expectation in Michael's eyes about the next day, the way Peter had cuddled up to him during the reading, and the drawing Julia had made of him. It was then that Richard realized his definition of success was changing. The numbers in spreadsheets and the million-dollar deals, which used to be his only measure of achievement, now seemed empty compared to the smiles and hugs from his children. Closing the laptop, Richard lay down, his mind not on the business, awaiting him, but on the small achievements and challenges that awaited him as a father. Tomorrow would be another day of balance, another day of choices. And for the first time in his life, he felt truly prepared to prioritize what really mattered. As sleep enveloped him, Richard smiled. The path ahead was still long and full of obstacles, but now he had an infallible compass guiding his decisions: love for his newly discovered family. Richard's office buzzed with activity that Thursday morning. Executives in suits circulated hurriedly, holding folders and talking on cell phones. In the center of this whirlwind, Richard found himself in his office, eyes fixed on the computer screen, but his mind was far away. "Mr. Matthews?" His assistant's voice brought him back to reality. "The board is waiting for you in the meeting room." Richard nodded, adjusting his tie. "Thank you, Camilla. I'll be there in a minute." As soon as the door closed, he picked up his cell phone and typed a quick message to Marianne. "Important meeting. I might be late to pick up the children from school. I'll let you know as soon as I can." The response came almost instantly. "Richard, you promised them. Try not to be late, please." He sighed, feeling the weight of guilt and responsibility. Putting the phone in his pocket, he headed to the meeting room. The atmosphere was tense when Richard entered. The board members stared at him with serious expressions. "Richard," began Charles, the board chairman, "we need to discuss your recent availability." Richard felt a knot in his stomach. He knew this moment would eventually come. "In recent months," Charles continued, "we've noticed a significant drop in your presence at the office. Rescheduled meetings, cancelled business trips, important decisions postponed. We understand that your personal situation has changed, but the company cannot suffer the consequences." Richard took a deep breath before responding. "Gentlemen, ladies, I understand your concerns. It's true that my personal life has undergone significant changes. I discovered I have 4 children, and I'm striving to be present in their lives. However, this doesn't mean my commitment to the company has diminished." "No one questions your commitment, Richard," intervened Martha, another board member, "but we question your ability to balance your new personal responsibilities with the demands of leading a company of this size." The words hit Richard like a punch to the stomach. He knew he was at a crossroads. The career he had sacrificed so much for now seemed to threaten the family he had barely begun to know. "I propose the following," said Richard, his mind working quickly. "Give me 3 months. We'll restructure some processes. I'll delegate more responsibilities to my immediate team, and we'll implement a more flexible work system, not just for me, but for all employees with families. If at the end of that period the results aren't satisfactory, I myself will present my resignation." A heavy silence fell over the room. The board members exchanged glances, some skeptical, others intrigued. Finally, Charles spoke. "All right, Richard, 3 months, but we'll be watching closely." The meeting extended for 2 more hours, discussing details and strategies. When it finally ended, Richard looked at the clock and his heart sank. It was already past the time to pick up the children from school. Running to his car, he tried to call Marianne, but it went to voicemail. He drove as fast as traffic allowed, his stomach churning with anxiety. Upon arriving at the school, he saw Marianne and the children sitting on the entrance steps. The little ones' faces lit up upon seeing him, but Marianne's look was one of pure disappointment. "Sorry for being late," he said, approaching. "The meeting extended longer than I expected." Anna ran to hug him, but Peter kept his distance, arms crossed. "You promised you wouldn't be late again," the boy murmured, the hurt evident in his voice. Richard felt as if his heart was being crushed. "I know, champ, I'm sorry. I promise I'll make it up to you." "You always promise," Peter responded quietly, turning to get into the car. On the way home, Richard tried to liven up the atmosphere, asking about the Children's Day, but the atmosphere remained tense. Marianne barely spoke, responding only with monosyllables when necessary. Upon arriving at the apartment, the children ran inside, leaving Richard and Marianne alone for a moment. "Marianne, She raised her hand, interrupting him. "No, Richard. I don't want to hear excuses. I want actions. The children need consistency, reliability. They can't be wondering if their father will show up or not." Her words hit him deeply. I know. I'm trying, Marianne, I really am, but it's not easy to balance everything. Her look softened a bit. I understand it's not easy. But Richard, being a father isn't something you do when it's convenient. It's a full-time commitment. That night, after helping the children with homework and putting them to bed, Richard sat in Marianne's apartment living room, his laptop open in front of him. He was determined to find a solution, a way to be present for his family without completely sacrificing his career. Hours passed as he worked on spreadsheets, reorganized schedules, and rethought corporate structures. When he finally looked at the clock, it was already past 2 in the morning. Closing the laptop, Richard walked silently down the hallway, stopping to look into each of the children's rooms. Seeing them sleeping peacefully reinforced his determination. He would make this work no matter what it took. Upon reaching the door, he found Marianne in the kitchen, a cup of tea in her hands. "You're still here," she said, surprised. Richard nodded. "I was working on some things. Marianne, I promise. I'll make this work. I'll find a balance." She observed him for a moment, her eyes seeking sincerity in his. "I hope so, Richard, for the children's sake, and for yours as well." As he drove back to the hotel that night, Richard reflected on the path ahead. He knew it wouldn't be easy. The corporate world didn't easily forgive, and being a father to 4 children demanded more than he had ever imagined. But, for the first time in his life, Richard felt he was fighting for something truly important. The challenge of the next 3 months was not just to prove to the board that he could lead the company. It was to prove to himself, to Marianne, and most importantly, to the children, that he could be the father they deserved. As the city lights passed by the car window, Richard made a silent promise. He would find a way to be successful in both aspects of his life, not because it was easy, but because it was necessary, because finally he understood what really mattered. The weeks that followed were a true test of fire for Richard. Days transformed into an endless sequence of juggling between corporate meetings and school events, contract negotiations, and homework help sessions. Every minute seemed like a battle against the clock, a constant struggle to be present in 2 worlds. That seemed increasingly incompatible. On a particularly hectic morning, Richard found himself in his office, eyes fixed on the computer screen, while participating in a crucial video conference with international investors. At the same time, his cell phone vibrated incessantly with messages from Marianne. "Michael has a fever. I need to take him to the doctor. Can you pick up the girls from school?" Richard felt his stomach sink. The meeting was far from over, and he had another one scheduled right after. But the thought of disappointing the children again was unbearable. With a deep sigh, he did something he would never have considered months ago. "Gentlemen," he interrupted the meeting, "I apologize, but a family emergency has arisen. I'll need to end my participation now. My team will continue the presentation, and I'm available to clarify any doubts later." The faces on the screen looked surprised, some even a bit irritated, but Richard didn't care. Quickly shutting down the computer, he grabbed his blazer and ran out of the office. "Camilla," he called to his assistant as he passed, "cancel my commitments for the rest of the day. Family emergency." The journey to the girls' school was tense, with Richard alternating between driving and responding to work messages at traffic lights. When he finally arrived, he saw Anna and Julia anxiously waiting at the entrance, their little faces lighting up when they spotted him. "Daddy!" they shouted in unison, running to hug him. "Hi, my princesses," he smiled, feeling the fatigue dissipate a bit. "How was your day?" As the girls chattered about their school adventures, Richard led them to the car, his mind divided between affection for his daughters and concern for Michael. On the way home, his phone rang. It was Charles, the board chairman. "Richard, what happened at the meeting?" "The investors were—" "Charles," Richard firmly interrupted, "I know the situation is delicate, but my son is sick. I'm on my way home now with my daughters. As soon as I can, I'll return the call and we'll sort this out." There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line before Charles responded, his voice softer. "I understand. I hope your son gets better. We'll talk later." Upon arriving home, he found Marianne in the living room, a feverish Michael, nestled in her arms. "How is he?" Richard asked, concern evident in his voice. "The doctor said it's just a strong cold," Marianne replied, looking exhausted. "But the fever won't break." Richard approached, placing his hand on his son's forehead. "Hey champ, Daddy's here now, okay?" Michael opened his eyes, a small weak smile forming on his lips. "Hi, Dad." The following hours were a mix of caring for Michael, attending to the girls, and furtive attempts to respond to urgent work emails. Peter, upon arriving from school, seemed surprised to see his father home so early. "Shouldn't you be working?" the boy asked, a mixture of curiosity and mistrust in his voice. Richard felt a tightness in his chest. It was painful to realize that his presence at home during the day was so unusual that it caused strangeness in his children. "Sometimes, Peter," he replied softly. "The most important work we have is to be with our family." As night fell, Michael's fever finally began to break. Richard, sitting on the edge of his son's bed, watched the boy sleep peacefully. That's when Marianne entered the room, 2 cups of coffee in her hands. "Thank you," he murmured, accepting the drink. "For everything." Marianne sat beside him, her eyes fixed on Michael. "You know, Richard, today was different." "How so?" "You chose to be here," she explained. "Without hesitation, without excuses. You were just here when we needed you." Richard felt a lump in his throat. "I should have done this from the beginning. I'm sorry it took me so long to understand." Marianne placed her hand on his, a gesture that caught him by surprise. "The important thing is that you're understanding now." At that moment, looking at his sleeping son and feeling Marianne's gentle touch, Richard had an epiphany. Success, he realized, was not measured by numbers on a spreadsheet or by the size of his bank account. It was measured by his children's smiles, by the renewed confidence in Marianne's eyes, by the feeling of peace that enveloped him now. "I need to make some changes," he said, more to himself than to Marianne. "What kind of changes?" she asked. Curious, Richard took a deep breath. "In the company, in my life, in everything. I can't continue living divided between 2 worlds. I need to find a way to integrate my professional and personal life in a way that allows me to be present for you without sacrificing everything I've built." Marianne observed him for a moment, a mix of hope and caution in her eyes. "And how do you plan to do that?" "I don't know exactly yet," he admitted, "but I know I need to start, for you, for me." In the days that followed, Richard immersed himself in an intense process of restructuring, both at the company and in his personal life. He delegated more responsibilities, implemented flexible work policies, and even considered the possibility of moving the company headquarters closer to home. Each decision was a step toward a new Richard, a man who finally understood that true legacy wasn't built in meeting rooms, but in the quiet moments with his children, in sincere conversations with Marianne, in the patient building of a family. As the changes began to take shape, Richard felt an internal transformation. The relentless executive gave way to a dedicated father. The workaholic yielded space to a man who valued balance. It was a challenging metamorphosis, sometimes painful, but deeply rewarding. And so, day after day, choice after choice, Richard built not just a new routine, but a new version of himself, a version that, he hoped, would be worthy of his children's love and Marianne's renewed trust. The path ahead was still long and uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, Richard felt he was on the right track. It was no longer a matter of choosing between family and career, but of finding a way to honor both parts of his life. And in this search for balance, he discovered a strength and purpose he never imagined he possessed. The sound of children's laughter echoed through the meeting room, a surreal contrast to the corporate environment that surrounded it. Richard, seated at the head of the table, couldn't contain a smile as he watched Anna drawing animatedly in a corner of the room, while Michael and Julia played quietly with educational tablets. As you can see, gentlemen, he continued his presentation, to the board members, our new family at work policy has not only improved employee satisfaction, but has also significantly increased our productivity in the last quarter. The executives exchanged skeptical glances, some clearly uncomfortable with the children's presence in the room. Charles, the board chairman, cleared his throat before speaking. Richard, we understand your personal situation, but transforming our work environment into a daycare? This seems a bit extreme, doesn't it? Richard remained calm, already expecting this reaction. It's not about transforming the office into a daycare, Charles. It's about creating an environment that recognizes that our employees have lives beyond these walls. The program is optional and has clear rules. The results speak for themselves. Martha, another board member, intervened. The numbers are impressive, I can't deny that. But what about the company's image? Our clients and partners may not view this favorably. It was at this moment that Peter, who had been quietly observing everything, stood up and walked over to Richard. Dad, can I say something? Richard hesitated for a moment, surprised, but nodded. Of course, son. Peter turned to the executives, his small figure erect with surprising confidence. Ladies and gentlemen, my father always taught me that a company is like a big family. If you take good care of your family, it takes good care of you. Isn't that what we're doing here? A stunned silence fell over the room. Richard felt his chest swell with pride, fighting against the emotion that threatened to overflow. Charles was the first to recover. With a slight smile, he leaned forward. Well, young Peter, I think you just gave the best presentation I've ever seen in this room. The tension in the room dissipated, giving way to laughter and a lighter atmosphere. The meeting proceeded, with the board members now more open to discussing the merits of the new program. Hours later, with the children already home with Marianne, Richard remained in his office reflecting on the day's events. His phone vibrated with a message from Marianne. The children can't stop talking about the day at the office, especially Peter. He's so proud. How was the meeting? Richard smiled, typing his response. It was interesting. I'll tell you everything. When I get home, Peter saved us today. Putting away the phone, Richard allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. The changes he had implemented were beginning to bear fruit, not only in his personal life, but also in business. However, he knew the path ahead would still be challenging. As he arranged his briefcase to leave, he heard a knock on the door. It was Charles. Richard, may I come in? Of course, Charles. What can I do for you? The board chairman entered, his expression serious. I want to talk about today, about all these changes you've been making. Richard felt a tightness in his stomach, preparing for the worst. Charles continued, You know, when you proposed all these crazy ideas a few months ago, I thought I was watching the end of your career. A CEO obsessed with family. It seemed like a recipe for disaster. He paused and Richard waited, tense. But today I saw something different. I saw a leader who not only talks about values, but lives them. I saw a company that's really caring about its employees, and most importantly, I saw results. Richard released the breath he hadn't even realized he was holding. Charles smiled slightly. Don't get me wrong. I still think you're treading on dangerous ground, but I'm willing to give more time to see where this leads. Just try not to turn all our meetings into bring your child to work sessions, okay? Richard laughed, feeling relief course through his body. Understood, Charles, and thank you for the trust. After Charles left, Richard finally left the office, eager to get home. On the way, he reflected on how his life had changed in recent months. The Richard of before would have stayed at the office until late, obsessed with reports and projections. Now his heart raced at the prospect of getting home, of hearing the children's stories about their day, of sharing dinner with Marianne. Upon arriving at the apartment, he was greeted by a chorus of "Dad," and soon found himself involved in a group hug. Marianne watched from the kitchen, a soft smile on her lips. During dinner, the children spoke all at once, excited about the experience at their father's office. Peter, especially, seemed radiant. "Dad, Did you see how I spoke to those men in suits? They really listened to me." Richard smiled, messing up his son's hair. "Yes, I did, champ. You were amazing. I think we have a future CEO in the family." Later, with the children in bed, Richard and Marianne sat on the balcony, enjoying a moment of calm. "So," Marianne began, "how was the meeting really?" Richard sighed, leaning back in his chair. "It was intense. There was resistance, as we expected. But I think we're on the right track. The changes are working, Marianne, not just for us, but for the entire company." She observed him for a moment, her eyes searching for something in his face. "You seem different, you know, more at peace." Richard reflected on this. "I think I am. For the first time in my life, I feel like I'm doing the right thing. Not just in business, but as a father, as a person." Marianne reached out, intertwining her fingers with his. The gesture, simple but laden with meaning, made Richard's heart leap. "I'm proud of you," she said softly. "The path you've chosen isn't easy, but you're making a difference. For the children, for the company, and for us." That us hung in the air, full of possibilities. Richard felt a wave of hope wash over him. Perhaps, just maybe, they were building not just a family, but a future together. "Marianne," he began, his voice low and intense, "I know I've made many mistakes in the past, that I've hurt you in ways that perhaps can never be completely repaired. But I want you to know that every day, every decision I make now is thinking of you all, of being the father our children deserve and the man you deserve." Marianne stared at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Richard, the road is long. There's still much to rebuild, to heal, but I'm happy we're walking together on this journey." They stayed there, hands intertwined, the silence of the night broken only by the distant sounds of the city. Richard knew that the challenges were far from over. There would be difficult days ahead, both at work and at home. But at that moment, sitting there with Marianne, knowing that his children slept safely just nearby, he felt a deep certainty. No matter what the future held, he was exactly where he should be. And for the first time in his life, Richard Matthews was truly home. The sound of the doorbell echoed through the apartment, breaking the tranquil routine of a Saturday morning. Richard, who was helping Michael with a science project at the kitchen, Ty Habel, exchanged an intrigued look with Marianne. "Are we expecting someone?" he asked. Marianne shook her head, wiping her hands on her apron as she headed to the door. When she opened it, her expression changed from curiosity to shock. "Mom? Dad?" Richard felt his stomach drop. Marianne's parents. He had never met them. And considering the circumstances of his relationship with Marianne in the past, he knew he probably wasn't their favorite person. "Surprise, darling," exclaimed Marianne's mother, entering the apartment with open arms. Her father followed, carrying suitcases. The children, hearing the unfamiliar voices, ran to the living room. "Grandma! Grandpa!" they shouted in unison, launching themselves into their grandparents' arms. Richard remained in the kitchen, suddenly feeling like an intruder in the family scene. Marianne gave him an apologetic look before turning back to her parents. "You should have let us know you were coming," she said, her voice a mixture of joy and concern. "And miss the chance to surprise our grandchildren?" laughed Marianne's mother. It was then that her eyes fell on Richard, who had finally gathered the courage to join the group in the living room. Her smile faltered for a moment. "And you must be—" "Richard," he introduced himself, extending his hand. "It's a pleasure to finally meet you, Mr. and Mrs. Wilson." Marianne's father shook his hand with more force than necessary. "Ah, yes, the famous Richard. We have a lot to talk about, young man." The following hours were a whirlwind of activity. The children, excited by their grandparents' presence, wanted to show every aspect of their lives. Richard found himself relegated to a secondary role, observing from afar as Marianne and her parents interacted with the children. During lunch, the tension was palpable. Marianne's parents asked polite questions, but their expressions made it clear they were evaluating Richard's every move. "So, Richard," began Mr. Wilson, his voice carrying a tone that mixed curiosity and challenge, "how exactly do you plan to make up for 5 years of absence in these children's lives?" Silence fell over the table. The children, sensing the tension, looked anxiously between Richard and their grandfather. Richard took a deep breath before responding. "Mr. Wilson, I know I've made unforgivable mistakes in the past. There's no excuse for my absence. All I can do now is be present every day and strive to be the father these children deserve." "Pretty words," retorted Mr. Wilson, "but actions speak louder." It was Peter who intervened, surprising everyone. "Grandpa, Dad has been trying really hard. He comes to my school presentations, helps me with homework, and even taught me to ride a bike last month." Mr. Wilson's eyes softened a bit as he looked at his grandson. "Is that so, Peter?" The other children also started speaking, each sharing a recent memory with Richard, his heart filled with emotion as he heard how his daily small actions had impacted his children. Marianne, who had been silent until then, finally spoke. "Mom, Dad, I know you have your reservations, and with good reason, but Richard has been amazing in recent months. He's really trying to be part of this family." Mrs. Wilson observed her daughter for a moment before turning to Richard. "And what about your work? I heard you're a big executive. How do you balance that with family life?" Richard smiled, grateful for the opportunity to talk about the changes he had implemented. "Actually, Mrs. Wilson, I've made several alterations at the company to prioritize the balance between work and family. We've implemented flexible work policies, created spaces for children at the office, and are even considering moving the company headquarters closer to home." Marianne's parents seemed genuinely impressed with this information. The rest of lunch proceeded more lightly, with the grandparents sharing stories of Marianne's childhood and the children laughing at their mother's antics when she was little. Later, while the children were showing their grandparents their rooms, Richard and Marianne had a moment alone in the kitchen. "Sorry about that," Marianne whispered. "I didn't know they were coming." Richard smiled, taking her hand. "It's okay, they have every right to be concerned. I'm happy to have the chance to show them that I've changed." Marianne looked into his eyes, her expression serious. "Richard, what you said at the table about moving the company headquarters, are you really considering that?" He nodded. "I am. In fact, it's more than just considering. I've already started looking for locations. I want to be closer to you all, Marianne. I want this to work, really." Her eyes filled with tears. "You really have changed, haven't you?" Before Richard could respond, they were interrupted by Mr. Wilson's voice. "Can I talk to you for a moment, Richard?" With one last reassuring look at Marianne, Richard followed Mr. Wilson to the balcony. The two men stood in silence for a few moments, observing the city below. "You know, Richard," Mr. Wilson began, "when Marianne told us about the pregnancy 5 years ago, and then about your disappearance, I swore that if I ever found you, things wouldn't be pleasant at all." Richard swallowed hard but remained silent. "But today," continued Mr. Wilson, "I saw something that surprised me. I saw the way the children look at you, how they talk about you, and more importantly, I saw Marianne's look. It's the same look my wife has for me after 40 years of marriage." He turned to face Richard. "I won't say all is forgiven. What you did was serious. But I'm willing to give you a chance, for Marianne and for the children." Richard felt a lump in his throat. "Thank you, Mr. Wilson. I promise I won't disappoint them." Mr. Wilson nodded. "See that you don't, young man, because if you do, there won't be a place in this world where you can hide from me." Despite the veiled threat, Richard couldn't help but smile. It was the acceptance he didn't know he desperately needed. When they returned inside, they found the living room full of laughter. The children were showing their grandparents a recent photo album full of moments captured in recent months. Richard teaching Peter to ride a bike, Anna in her ballet presentation, a picnic in the park with the whole family. Marianne approached Richard, intertwining her fingers with his. "Is everything okay?" she whispered. He nodded, pulling her closer. "Better than okay." Observing the scene before him, the children's smiles, the look of reluctant approval from Marianne's parents, the warmth of her hand in his, Richard felt a wave of gratitude wash over him. The path to get here hadn't been easy, and he knew there would still be challenges ahead. But at that moment, surrounded by his family, Richard understood that he had finally found his place in the world. It wasn't at the top of a corporate skyscraper or in a luxurious meeting room. It was there, in that cozy apartment, with the sound of his children's laughter and Marianne's love by his side. And for the first time in his life, Richard Matthews felt truly complete. The sun had barely risen when Richard woke up, the soft sound of Marianne's breathing beside him. He smiled, remembering the night before, a deep conversation that extended into the early hours of the morning, culminating in a moment of intimacy they hadn't shared in a long time. Carefully, so as not to wake her, Richard got up and went to the kitchen. He decided to prepare breakfast for everyone, a small gesture that had become part of his new routine. As the coffee maker hummed and the smell of toast filled the air, he reflected on how much his life had changed in recent months. The sound of small footsteps pulled him from his thoughts. Anna appeared at the kitchen door, her hair disheveled and her eyes still sleepy. "Good morning, Princess," Richard smiled, bending down to hug her. "Good morning, Daddy," she murmured, nestling in his arms. "Are you staying home today?" The question, so simple, carried a weight that Richard felt deeply. "Yes, my love, today is Saturday, remember? We're going to spend the whole day together." Anna's face lit up with a smile. "Can we go to the park?" "Of course," he replied, kissing the top of her head. "We'll ask your brothers and sister what they want to do too, okay?" Gradually, the house came to life. Michael and Julia joined, them in the kitchen, followed by a still sleepy Peter. Marianne was the last to appear, smiling as she saw the family scene before her. "Good morning, family," she said, accepting the cup of coffee Richard offered her. Breakfast proceeded amid laughter and plans for the day. Richard observed, amazed, how something as simple as a family meal could bring so much joy. After breakfast, while the children prepared for the park outing, Richard and Marianne had a moment alone. "About last night," Richard began, a bit hesitant. Marianne placed her hand on his arm, gently interrupting him. "It was good, Richard, really good." He smiled, feeling a mixture of relief and hope. "Marianne, I want to make this work. Us, this family, everything." She studied him for a moment, her eyes searching for something in his. "I want that too, Richard. But we need to go slow. There's a lot to rebuild." Richard nodded, understanding. "One day at a time." "One day at a time," she agreed, leaning in for a quick kiss before the children returned. The day at the park was filled with precious moments. Richard pushed Anna on the swing, helped Michael build an elaborate sandcastle, played frisbee with Peter, and proudly watched as Julia showed off her skills on the jungle gym. In the middle of the afternoon, while the children played and Marianne took a nap in the shade of a tree, Richard's phone rang. It was Charles. "Richard, sorry to interrupt your weekend, but we have a situation. The contract with the Chinese company, they're threatening to back out if we don't close by Monday." Richard felt the familiar weight of corporate responsibility fall on his shoulders. He looked at his family, happy and carefree in the park, and then back at the phone in his hand. "Charles, I know," Charles interrupted him. "It's your day with the family. But this is big, Richard. It could mean millions for the company." Richard closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. Months ago, he wouldn't have hesitated to drop everything and run to the office. But now... "Charles, listen, I'll send you some files I prepared about the contract. Take a look at them and call me back in an hour. We'll solve this, but I'm not going to abandon my family today." There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line before Charles responded, "Understood, 1 hour then." Hanging up the phone, Richard noticed Marianne watching him, a concerned expression on her face. "Is everything okay?" she asked when he approached. Richard sat beside her, briefly explaining the situation. "But don't worry," he assured. "I'm not going to run off to the office. I promised a family day, and that's what we'll have." Marianne studied him for a moment before smiling. "You really have changed, haven't you?" "I'm trying," he responded. Honestly. The children soon joined them, tired but happy. While they shared a snack, Richard explained that he would need to make a quick work call. "But Dad," Michael protested, "you promised today was family day." Richard ruffled his son's hair affectionately. And it is, champ. I'll make this call really quickly, and then it's just us for the rest of the day, okay? The children nodded, still a bit suspicious. Richard moved away a little, keeping the family in his sight as he discussed the contract details with Charles. 20 minutes later, he returned, a satisfied smile on his face. "All sorted?" Marianne asked. Richard nodded. "All sorted. And the best part is that we managed it without me having to abandon our day." The rest of the afternoon passed peacefully. Back at the apartment, the evening was filled with board games, laughter, and finally, a family movie with everyone piled onto the sofa. Later, with the children in bed, Richard and Marianne found themselves again on the balcony, the place that had become their refuge for important conversations. "You know," Marianne began, her voice soft in the night, "there was a moment today in the park when I saw you playing with the children. It was as if everything finally clicked into place." Richard looked at her, feeling his heart race. What do you mean?" She smiled, her eyes shining in the moonlight. "It was like I could see our future, Richard. A life together, raising these wonderful children. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel afraid of that future." Richard took her hand, intertwining their fingers. "Marianne, I know we still have a lot to rebuild. I know I hurt you deeply in the past, but I want you to know that I'm committed to this future. With you, with the children, with our family." Marianne observed him for a long moment before leaning in and kissing him softly. "I know," she whispered against his lips, "and I'm ready for us to build this future together." That night, lying in bed with Marianne nestled in his arms, Richard reflected on his journey. From an executive focused only on success and money, he had transformed into a man who finally understood the true meaning of wealth. The path ahead would still be challenging. There would be difficult days, moments of doubt, and obstacles to overcome. But now, with Marianne's love and his children's support, Richard knew he could face anything. As sleep enveloped him, he smiled, grateful for the second chance life had given him. A chance to be the father his children deserved, the partner Marianne deserved, and finally the man he always wanted to be. And so, lulled by the soft sound of his family's breathing, Richard Matthews fell asleep, no longer a lonely CEO, but a man truly rich in love, purpose, and happiness. The sound of horns and the bustle of the city entered through the open window of Richard's office. He looked thoughtfully at the urban landscape of New York, his mind divided between the document on his desk and the plans for the family dinner that night. A light tap on the door brought him back to reality. It was Camilla, his assistant. "Mr. Matthews, the committee is ready for the presentation." Richard nodded, adjusting his tie. "Thank you, Camilla. I'll be there in a minute." Before leaving, his eyes fell on the family photo on his desk, Marianne and the 4 children smiling at a recent picnic. He took a deep breath, seeking strength in the image, and then headed to the meeting room. The atmosphere was tense when he entered. Board members and senior executives observed him with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Richard knew that what he was about to propose would drastically change the course of the company and possibly his career. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice firm, "in recent months, we've implemented several changes in our work policy, focusing on the balance between professional and personal life. The results have been remarkable: increased productivity, reduced turnover, and significant improvement in employee satisfaction." Murmurs of agreement ran through the room. Richard continued, "Today, I want to propose the next step in this journey, a change that I believe will not only benefit our company, but will also have a positive impact on our city and community." He paused dramatically before revealing, "I propose that we move our company headquarters to a more residential area of New York, creating a complex that integrates offices, daycares, recreational areas, and green spaces. A place where our employees can work close to their families, reducing commute time and increasing quality of life." The silence that followed was deafening. Richard could see expressions of shock, disbelief, and on some faces, genuine interest. Charles, the board chairman, was the first to speak. "Richard, this is ambitious. The costs would be astronomical, not to mention the logistical and legal challenges." Richard nodded. already expecting this reaction. Yes, Charles, it is an ambitious project, but I believe the long-term benefits will far outweigh the initial costs. Imagine a happier, more productive and more loyal workforce. Imagine the positive impact on the local community, and think of the message we would be sending, that we truly value our people. The following hours were of intense debate. Richard presented financial projections, case studies of companies that implemented similar models, and a detailed phased implementation plan. At the end of the meeting, although there wasn't a definitive decision, it was clear that the idea had planted a seed. The board agreed to form a committee to study the feasibility of the project. Exhausted but satisfied, Richard returned to his office. He looked at the clock. He still had time to get home for dinner with the family. As he gathered his things, his phone vibrated with a message from Marianne. "The children are excited for dinner. How was the meeting?" He smiled, typing his response. "It was intense but promising. I can't wait to tell you all. I'm on my way." On the way home, Richard reflected on how his life had changed. A few months ago, he would have stayed at the office until late, obsessed with reports and projections. Now his priority was to get home for dinner with his family. Upon entering the apartment, he was greeted by a chorus of "Dad," and soon found himself involved in a group hug. The smell of home cooking filled the air, and Richard felt a wave of gratitude wash over him. During dinner, the children spoke animatedly about their day. Peter had gotten the highest grade on a math test. Anna was excited about her next ballet presentation. Michael was telling about a new friend he had made at school, and Julia proudly showed a drawing she had made. Richard listened attentively, asking questions and offering praise. Marianne observed him with a soft smile, noting how he seemed truly present and engaged. Later, with the children in bed, Richard and Marianne sat on the balcony, sharing a bottle of wine. "So," Marianne began, "how was the meeting, really?" Richard sighed, leaning back in his chair. "It was intense. I proposed something big, Marianne, something that could change not just our company, but potentially the lives of many families." He explained his proposal in detail, observing Marianne's reactions. When he finished, she was looking at him with a mixture of pride and concern. "Richard, that's amazing. Really amazing, but it's a huge risk. What if it doesn't work out?" He took her hand, squeezing it gently. "It is a risk, yes, but I think it's worth it. You know, I spent years building a successful company, but only now do I understand what really matters. If we can create an environment where other families can have what we have now, time together, balance, happiness, wouldn't that be true success?" Marianne studied him for a moment before smiling. "Who would have thought that the Richard Matthews I met years ago would become this man in front of me? I'm proud of you, you know?" Richard felt his heart expand with these words. "Thank you, Marianne, for believing in me, for giving me a second chance, for this family." They remained silent for a moment, just enjoying each other's company and the quiet night. "You know," Marianne finally said, "with all these changes happening, maybe it's time we make a change of our own as well." Richard looked at her, intrigued. "What do you mean?" Marianne took a deep breath before continuing. "I've been thinking, maybe it's time we make things official. You, me, the children, being a real family, legally." Richard's heart leaped. "Marianne, are you—" She smiled, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Yes, Richard, I think I'm ready for us to get married, if you want, of course." In a quick movement, Richard knelt before her, taking her hands in his. "Marianne Wilson, would you do me the honor of marrying me?" Her answer came in the form of a passionate kiss, interrupted only by the sounds of celebration coming from the balcony door. The children, who apparently weren't as asleep as they thought, had witnessed the moment. As the family gathered in a group hug, laughing and crying with joy, Richard felt that finally everything was in the right place. The future might bring challenges at work, at home, in life, but now he knew he could face anything with his family by his side. That night, looking at the sleeping Marianne and thinking of the children in their rooms, Richard reflected on his journey. From a lonely executive focused only on financial success, he had transformed into a man who valued above all love, family, and balance. And as sleep enveloped him, Richard smiled, grateful for the life he had built, and excited for the future that awaited him. A bright future full of love, challenges, and above all, the joy of a united family. The sun had barely risen when Richard woke up, his mind already racing with the numerous commitments of the day. Beside him, Marianne still slept peacefully, the engagement ring shining softly on her hand. He smiled, remembering the night he had proposed just 2 weeks ago. Silently, Richard got up and went to the kitchen. While preparing coffee, his phone vibrated with a message from Charles. Meeting at 9 a.m. to discuss the new complex project. The committee has some concerns. Richard sighed. He knew convincing the board wouldn't be easy, but he was determined to make his project work. "I'll be there," he replied. Shortly after, Marianne entered the kitchen, followed by the still sleepy children. "Good morning, family," Richard smiled, distributing kisses and hugs. "Dad," Anna asked while biting into a piece of toast, "when are we going to choose my bridesmaid dress?" "Soon, Princess," he promised. "How about next weekend?" The girl's eyes lit up with excitement. Marianne approached, kissing him softly. "Don't forget we have a meeting with the wedding planner." "Tonight?" Richard nodded, checking his phone. "I'll be home in time, I promise." Breakfast proceeded amid laughter and animated plans for the wedding. The children discussed their roles in the ceremony, while Marianne and Richard exchanged complicit glances, both marveling at the happiness that surrounded them. Later at the office, Richard found himself before the board, presenting the details of his ambitious project. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "I know the initial cost seems frightening, but think of the long-term benefits. Reduced employee turnover, increased productivity, improved quality of life for our teams, not to mention the positive impact on the local community." Charles, the board chairman, frowned. "Richard, we understand your vision, but the shareholders are concerned. This project could significantly affect our profits in the short term." Richard took a deep breath, preparing for the argument he had rehearsed countless times. "Charles, for years we've focused only on immediate profits. But what if we could create something truly revolutionary? Something that not only generates profits but also makes a real difference in people's lives." He paused, looking at each board member. "Imagine a company where employees don't just work but live, grow, and thrive. Where their families are part of our corporate community. This would not only increase loyalty and productivity, but would also position us as leaders in corporate social responsibility." The silence that followed was tense. Richard could see thoughtful expressions on the faces around the table. Finally, Martha, one of the most influential directors, spoke. "It's risky, no doubt, but it's also visionary. Perhaps it's time we think beyond quarterly numbers." The following hours were of intense debate. Richard answered countless questions, presented detailed financial projections, and shared success stories of companies that had implemented similar models on a smaller scale. At the end of the meeting, although there wasn't a definitive approval, there was a consensus to proceed with more in-depth studies and a smaller-scale pilot. Exhausted but satisfied, Richard left the office, eager to share the news with Marianne. On the way home, he made a quick stop at a flower shop, choosing a beautiful bouquet of lilies, her favorite flowers. Upon arriving home, he was greeted by the delicious aroma of dinner being prepared and the sound of laughter coming from the kitchen. He found Marianne and the children preparing the meal together, a scene that warmed his heart. "Hello, family," he announced, presenting the flowers to Marianne with a kiss. "How was the meeting, Dad?" Peter asked, curious. Richard ruffled his son's hair, smiling. "It was good, champ. I think we're on the right track." During dinner, Richard shared the details of the meeting, his voice full of enthusiasm as he described his vision for the future of the company. Marianne listened attentively, her eyes shining with pride. "That's amazing, Richard," she said when he finished. "You're really making a difference." As the evening progressed, Richard felt a deep contentment settle over him. Surrounded by his soon-to-be wife and their children, engaged in animated conversation about the wedding plans, He knew he had finally found the balance he had been seeking for so long. Later, as he lay in bed, Marianne nestled against his chest, Richard marveled at the journey that had brought him here, from a single-minded pursuit of corporate success to a life rich in love and meaning. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, a meeting with the wedding planner, ongoing negotiations about the new complex, and the daily juggling act of balancing work and family. But for the first time, Richard felt truly equipped to face them all. With Marianne's steady breathing as a lullaby, he closed his eyes, grateful for the twists of fate that had reunited him with his family and for the strength he had found to become the man they deserved. As sleep claimed him, Richard's last thought was a simple prayer of thanks for the most precious gift of all, the chance to love and be loved in return.